Chance to read the report in full, but certainly we'll do that over the next few days. What I do want to do though is begin where the Royal Commission itself begins and acknowledge that the Covid-19 global pandemic was an incredibly challenging time for a lot of New Zealanders. Those who were out of the country and had experienced travel restrictions found it incredibly difficult. Those who were in New Zealand found issues around lockdowns in particular and restrictions that were put in place really challenging. There's nothing that can happen now that will compensate for those who were not there when somebody passed away, were unable to be there for the birth of a child, or all of those other major disruptions that New Zealanders experienced. I like to think that during the pandemic response we did try and acknowledge those things and recognise that for a lot of Kiwis it was a really, really difficult time. Having said that, I'm sure the Royal Commission will bring that back for many people. Also, the Royal Commission has made some findings around vaccination. I haven't worked my way through that in its totality. They found that the vaccine mandates were justified, that the vaccine passes were justified, but they have also made some recommendations about the vaccine mandates going too far in some areas, being in place for too long in some areas. I haven't had a chance to study those in detail yet, but certainly we'll do that. So if you're wanting detailed comment on the recommendations they've made in that area, I haven't actually had a chance to study them yet, so can't give you detailed comment on those. But overall, I guess the finding or one of the main responses here is I think it's a really useful report. It does draw on information in many cases that's only available in retrospect, so wasn't available to us at the time we were making decisions. But it is really important that we learn from the overall pandemic experience, that we are better prepared for a future pandemic, because it's not a question of if it will happen, it's a question of when. And there's certainly lessons that can be learned. I'm happy to take your questions.
Do you recognise that the response that you oversaw means that we can no longer ever respond in the same way to a pandemic?
I don't think you can draw that conclusion based on what's happening now. If you'd have said to me 5 years ago, for example, that during a pandemic we would close the border and we would impose the sort of restrictions that we did and that people would voluntarily follow them to the degree that they did, I'm not sure I would have believed that at that time. I think people very much will respond to the information that's available at the time. And the way people feel about that now isn't necessarily going to be the way they feel about that at the start of a pandemic.
Do you accept that the mandates in particular affected social cohesion to a point?
Oh, absolutely. I think there are two things. If you go back to the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, I think there were two things that were incredibly challenging. One was vaccine, and the second was issues around the Auckland lockdown. And I've spoken before about that, about the fact that I think we lost the room in Auckland at the end of that Auckland lockdown. I think people had stopped following some of the lockdown restrictions, and I've said that before.
Do you agree with the finding? Do you agree with the finding around I suppose, how we respond to a future pandemic, right? So it said that it could hinder future responses. Do you agree with that?
I haven't had a chance to study the detail of it. Like I said, I've only read the executive summary, but I would say that one of the challenges in responding to the pandemic right the way through was that public sentiment and public opinion, public willingness around different measures changed all of the time, and that was one of the things that we had to respond to. So public's tolerance for things like lockdowns was very high at the beginning and of course got less as the pandemic went along. And even that was before vaccination. So even before vaccines were available, we saw that the longer any restrictions were in place, the less likely people were to comply with them. So I think that we should always reflect on that.
It makes quite a pointed comment about how long MIQ was in place. You didn't start lifting MIQ restrictions until Omicron was well into the community here. It was spreading everywhere. Do you regret that?
I think there were a range of factors that involved how we reopened the border. We had started planning for that well in advance of when the border did open. And one of the things that we were looking at, and Ashley Bloomfield was particularly, strident on this, is the more presentations that you get of the virus, the harder it would have been for us to continue to suppress the virus within the community, even as it was starting to spread.
The border controls were there to stop community transmission, to stop the exacerbation of community transmission. Omicron was being transmitted in the community widely, and it wasn't just in Auckland, it was everywhere, and you kept a border in place that split families apart? Do you regret that?
I think what we're talking about here, though, is I think and with the benefit of hindsight, there could be weeks. I don't think we're talking months, but I think there could be weeks of difference. And I recognise for those families who are, experienced that, those weeks could have made a big difference.
Looking back, do you think the mandates were a mistake?
The Royal Commission did not reach that conclusion. They did reach the conclusion that they went a bit too far in some areas, and I accept that finding. I'm not going to contest that. I can tell you that as one of the ministers responsible for making those decisions, there wasn't a day go by when we weren't thinking very actively about them. It was probably, I think, the two most difficult sets of decisions during the whole COVID response were around border restrictions and vaccination. Because of the huge impact that they had for individuals. And so, no, I don't think they were a mistake, but I do acknowledge they came at a very big cost.
On future pandemics, do you think that we'll be able to get as much buy-in as we did for COVID in future events?
I think part of that will depend on how soon they are, how far away from these events they are, and the nature of them.
What do you mean?
Well, because I think we were even finding during our response to COVID, bigger gaps between events meant higher compliance, and so if they were close together, you tended to get fatigue. I think that is just the nature of these events. You do get fatigue the more you're asking people to make sacrifices and to do things.
Do you think that will be contributed to by the measures that you implemented and have been highlighted in this report as being too far?
I accept the Royal Commission's findings that there will be things that we can do differently, or that as a country that there are things that we can do differently. I'll certainly, I hope that it will be well after my time in politics is over, a long way into the future before the country faces this kind of situation again. But I do think that, with the benefit of hindsight, we get the opportunity to learn from our experiences, and I think it's really important we do that.
At what point did you recognise that the response was affecting social cohesion?
It was pretty obvious to everybody who saw the number of people out the front, occupying Parliament, that social cohesion. No, I think we were starting to see it at the end of that Auckland lockdown period before Christmas in 2021, that we were seeing that people had, the fatigue was real. I think the COVID fatigue was real.
Was it hard to get to sort of bring longer-term strategic thinking into the picture in those later days? One of the findings of the commission was that, decisions made, easy to make, decisions were more effectively made earlier on, but then you make to the longer-term picture.
I think we found long-term strategic decisions really difficult right the way through the pandemic because everything kept changing so rapidly. So we set up that group that was chaired by Professor David Skegg to do some of those longer-term scenario plans. If you went back and looked at that material now, you'd probably find that none of the scenarios that were envisaged at the time are exactly how things panned out. Everything kept changing. The variation when we got to Delta, the variation when we got to Omicron, for example, in terms of the way the virus was behaving, wasn't always readily apparent for some time after the fact. And so that made long-term planning quite challenging.
If you were to have your time again, would you make vaccine passes voluntary for businesses to adopt? So make it available for them, but it was up to businesses whether or not they implemented them, and therefore up to consumers whether they went to those businesses or ones that didn't have mandates.
I think it would very much depend on the circumstances of what you were dealing with. That's a really hard one, and we wrestled a lot with that at the time as to whether it should be voluntary or compulsory. The Royal, it's quite difficult because I haven't read all of the detail, but I know the Royal Commission, for example, found that requiring them in a hospitality setting and then requiring people who are working in hospitality to be vaccinated as part of that was a reasonable requirement to put in place. And so I accept the Royal Commission's finding, but again, I want to read the detail of what they've said before I might speculate on how we might do it differently.
And what about the essential workers definition? There was a lot of people that felt that the brakes that were put on the economy could have been lessened, like forestry workers that were working alone could have gone to work, or construction workers that were driving equipment by themselves could have gone to work. Would you change that if you were presented with the same set of circumstances?
Yeah, so we did keep changing those as we went along. So you might remember that relatively early on in the response to the pandemic, we did introduce the sole trader, the people working alone rule that said that if you were working somewhere by yourself and you weren't coming into contact with others, you could go to work. So if you were working in a workshop, you were the only one there, you could go to work. I think probably now as well, and again, there wasn't always information about this at the time, but outdoor spaces, so people working in outdoor spaces, we probably could have been more liberal in that area as well.
Is there one thing you could do that you would point to as the biggest lesson of the COVID response?
Social cohesion is incredibly important. The public's willingness to follow whatever you're asking them to do is very, very important. That was really, really challenging in the vaccination period because whilst I know everybody looks back on it now with a slightly different lens to what they were looking at on it at the time, we've got to remember that how people felt about those things at the time was different. We had very large groups of people refusing to go to work unless everybody in their workplace was vaccinated. I know everybody forgets that now, but that was actually one of the things that the government had to weigh up at the time, was that we did want to get people back to work. And so those were all really, really difficult choices at the time.
Given you are so sort of personally connected to the COVID-19 response, as these reports come out and you're saying that you're not contesting some of those findings, potentially you did make some mistakes, have you made any kind of considerations about how you might attempt to repair that relationship with some New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, look, I want to read the full report before making that conclusion. As I said, I've read the executive summary and there wasn't a lot in there that I found that I disagreed with, although I did constantly find myself sort of saying we didn't know that at the time, because that's the nature of these things. You get more information and you can remake decisions in retrospect based on new information, but you can't necessarily go back and say you'd make a different decision if you still didn't know that information at the time.
But do you need to apologise anything?
Like I said, I'll read the full report before making any conclusions on that.
Do these recommendations particularly surprise you, or a lot of them are things that are clear to you in hindsight as well?
No, well, many of them were actually on the basis of the quite lengthy conversations that we as a government had with the Royal Commission. So I spent several hours with them, was pretty open with them about areas where I thought we could have improved. So some of the stuff around long-term planning, for example, they came from observations that I made. Even some candid observations I shared with them about that Auckland lockdown and the fact that, I think we had sort of lost a lot of the buy-in by the end of that process. I mean, I was pretty candid with the Royal Commission, and I think some of that's reflected in the report that they've produced.
Do you wish that the government didn't define itself as the single source of truth, and how much that, do you have any regrets about how much that impacted disinformation and trust in institutions?
I think that quote, which was quite specific to a particular issue, then came to be seen as our statement on everything to do with COVID, which I don't think was ever the intention. So that quote came up particularly about the issue of COVID-19 cases circulating within the community and whether or not there were cases circulating in the community and we were somehow not telling people about that. And so the single source of truth quote actually came from us saying, if there are, we will tell you, and we will tell you through this mechanism. I don't think it was ever intended to be that that every decision that we took was uncontestable and that no one else was entitled to an opinion. But of course that became the received sort of folklore around that particular statement. But I don't think that was ever what was intended.
Sure, but
I mean, I wasn't the one that made the statement, but also I do know where it came from.
there was also the fact that you guys only held those 1 p.m. press conferences and shut down a lot of other voices, and we weren't able to talk directly to ministries only through that 1 p.m. press conference, and how much focus there was on it. In hindsight, was that communication strategy with the public the right way to go?
No, I don't necessarily accept that. So if you look at the 1 p.m. press conference became a very focal point, but there were also regularly people from the public service and the wider COVID-19 response regularly appearing in the media
Only through that 1 p.m. press
No, not through the 1 p.m. press
A lot of
conference.
it.
I can tell you, I was out of bed almost every morning at 6 o'clock to be here to answer questions live on TV and elsewhere. So was Ashley, so was the people involved in running MIQ. You know, I think we did try and be as accountable as possible during that time. I'll accept many criticisms. I won't accept the criticism that we weren't available to answer questions. I think we were being as available as we possibly could.
Right.
Some of the issue was that we were being asked questions we didn't know the answer to, and that again is a challenging situation. So, and I'm now, but you know, in folklore, being attributed with having statements attributed to me that were said by others and that I actually denied. So there's a regular statement made about the I think there were 3 in the end, women who crossed the Northland boundary. The statements that were made accusing them of being prostitutes were made by Winston Peters, not by me, though I in fact denied them, but I'm still being held responsible for them.
The report.
New Zealand is sort of randomly consign the COVID periods to their memory, you know, and not to be represented again. How does it feel to look at the report now and to sort of relive some of that?
There's a little bit of that too. I think, you know, the whole country has moved on a lot from COVID. It was a really tough time, and I think even people who were very, very supportive of, you know, everything that the government did prefer not to think about it now. And I understand that, because it was really tough. And if you were personally affected by things like border restrictions, by some of those particularly those early restrictions, when no one really fully understood the virus, it's still quite traumatic, I think, for people to look back on that period. It's not about me, and I've tried, and all the way through the pandemic, of course it was bloody hard for those involved in leading it, but I tried very hard during that time not to make it about me, and I'll continue to try and do that.
Just building on that, like a lot of it is about you. You played a pretty central role there, and I mean the report, it'll be no surprise as far as social cohesion goes. That finding will be of no surprise to you, I can imagine. So how comfortably does that sit with you as far from a legacy point of view, that this will be one of the main fixtures of your political career?
If we had been making decisions based on how we thought things would be perceived some distant time into the future, and we'd been focused on legacy, we probably would have made a different set of decisions. The decisions that we took at the time were based on what was the best thing that we could do at that time, based on the information that we had available at that time. Benefit of hindsight is always a wonderful thing. We didn't have hindsight when we were making those decisions. In terms of the personal effect, of course it had a huge personal effect. I mean, sleep was very difficult for about 2 years because there was just so many things happening, and every day you were wondering what's going to go wrong tomorrow. But I balanced that out every day by thinking, well, actually, if you're someone who's overseas and you can't come home to see a loved one who's dying, or you're someone who's just lost your business, or you're someone who can't be there for the birth of a child, actually, it's even harder for you. And so you've always got to keep a sense of perspective.
The question's more about, I suppose, your reflections on being one of the politicians, or a politician who has, through this report anyway, been found to have caused devolving social cohesion, right? Yeah. Which would be the opposite aim for pretty much every politician.
Well, but I think you've got to weigh that against the alternatives as well. We achieved very high social cohesion at the start of our pandemic response. We achieved one of the lowest death rates in the world from COVID-19. Yeah. We actually had some of the fewest days of restrictions of any other country. Our kids missed less days in education than just about any other country. And I think I'm pretty proud of those things.
Setting that to one side, though, obviously that's part of it, and you're acknowledging that, but then the result has been devolving social cohesion. So how do you reflect on that personally?
But those two things are related.
And you're addressing the first one, but the second one?
Well, like I said, all the way through the response, there were really hard trade-offs. In order to achieve those things, there was a high price for them.
I guess in the same vein, but in a different question, do you wish you acknowledged the concerns of those who were hesitant about the mandates in particular earlier and addressed that before it ended in a fire on the front lawn?
If you go back and you look at all of the press conferences that I did around COVID-19 vaccines, you will find that we were acknowledging those at the time. Why didn't I go and talk to them? I think that was pretty obvious. When they have a noose hanging at the front of the protest with my name on it, would you go and speak to them?
But did it have to get to that point? Did it have to get to the point of nooses? Was there something that the government could have done earlier to acknowledge the concerns of those who were, a lot of them were really scared?
Yeah, a lot of people were scared right the way through the response to the pandemic, and we have to, acknowledge that there was always a difficult set of trade-offs and, and competing interests to be balanced there.
Chris, how would you describe your relationship or the response with the Kiwi?
I think it was strong in part, and then, room for improvement in others. So we consulted quite extensively with iwi through the response. I think right the way through the response, they were pressuring us to do more and to do it faster. And I think if you look at the Royal Commission's report, or the bits of it that I've seen, I think they made some pretty good conclusions there about how we could do that better. I haven't spoken to her yet. I'm sure at some point we will have a conversation about it. I imagine. Well, I understand it's online. I read it online, so I hadn't seen it before it was released this afternoon. So.
One of the recommendations is around ensuring the health system is able to scale up in the event of a pandemic. Are you concerned about the current capabilities of the health system and the public sector generally?
Well, I'm concerned if you look at where they're making cuts to the health system right now. They're in the very areas the Royal Commission says we need to be doing more. So there are some pretty big cuts currently being contemplated or consulted on in the public health teams. Actually, it was the public health teams that we found we needed a lot more resource and more people when we got into the pandemic response. So there's a real risk we're going to lose a lot of that if they go ahead with the cuts that they're currently consulting on.
Were you completely blinded by just chasing an elimination strategy?
No, not at all. But the transition from an elimination strategy to having COVID in the community was incredibly bumpy. So it wasn't that we didn't anticipate that was going to happen at some point, but the way it happened was certainly very bumpy.
But did anyone plan for it? Was there any planning for coming out of elimination?
Yes, and as I said, that was exactly some of the stuff that David Skegg's group was doing. It was what the Reconnecting New Zealand strategy was all about. Having said that, again, the fact that there were a whole lot of things that were quite hard to plan for made that difficult. So again, we were dealing with that right at the same time as we transitioned from Delta to Omicron, for example, and that kind of changed the rules of the game again.
We were also going through to make it up as you go, level 3.5, level 2.5, level...
Yeah, if I was going to do some of those things differently, one of them would be not to move from the alert level system to the traffic light system, because I actually think that probably confused people. We should have just adapted the alert level system to include vaccinations and other things like that. So I think that just added a layer of complexity that was harder to communicate. No.
Are you relieved it's over?
Oh, totally. I've been relieved it's over for several years now, but I am very proud of New Zealand's overall response. There are always lessons to learn, and I think that the Royal Commission has highlighted them.
Are you up for being a minister in charge of a pandemic response again?
It's not one that I'd put my hand up to be front of the queue for, but if it happens, it happens. No, I mean, look, it's a lesson in government. You have to take the good and the bad in equal measure when you're in government. You can't control the circumstances that you're presented with. You can just do the best you can do with what you have available at the time.
You went Prime Minister, but you kind of got thrown in midway after someone else decided, right? Very beginning of it. What was the thing that surprised you most when you showed up in David Clark's old office? What was going on? Was it a shambles?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that at all. I think one of the things that we tried to do what I tried to do right at the start was, we were only a couple of months in, and so it was still very much an emergency response. And so one of the things that I tried to do right at the beginning was separate out the day-to-day emergency response from the fact that we actually needed some better systems and processes, including splitting people into teams, for example, because at that point everyone was just working around the clock. And so one of the first things that I did, including in my own office, was actually separate people and move people onto shifts, because otherwise everyone was just going to be burnt out really quickly. But again, that was... It's easy to look back on that now and say, oh, we should have done this sooner or we should have done that sooner. At the time, it's just overwhelming. Just everything keeps coming at you every day.
Just on another topic.
Okay.
Really quickly on another topic. Are you worried that your members basically want to give much as what a veto over your decision?
No, I mean, I think The tax decision that we took at the last election, which I know some of our members are unhappy about, was actually approved through the usual policy process for the party. It was approved by the MPs, it was approved by the party's policy council, and so I'm not that worried about that at all. No, I didn't. You called it a captain's call. I never called that. Well, I said it was my recommendation, but it still went through the proper policy process of the party.
That was you're talking about the GST.
No, I think it was. I think the one that.
That went through the process, but not the call.
No, the issues around wealth tax and capital gains tax also went through the process as well.
What about the 2017 CGT captain's calls? Did they go through the process?
No, they didn't, and I wasn't the one that made those.
Yeah, but so there is a mechanism for a Labour leader to make a captain's call, right? Because Jacinda Ardern did it.
No, I mean, ultimately, I think people talk about captain's calls. I think in any political environment, a leader has to be able to say, "That's not something that I'm willing to do." But that's the essence of leadership. I don't think that that's the intention of what they're putting forward. No, I think it says. I think the remit itself is quite confused. That's not unusual when these things happen. You know, democracy is a wonderful thing, but it's.